When I first started cycling about 8 years ago now, I wanted a cheap and simple way to measure my training zones, intervals and efforts on the bike. I knew the methods of tracking this, like power or heart rate, things I'd used on my sports science degree so many times before, but just having finished university and just having bought a bike, I didn't have the money to buy a power meter or a heart rate strap alongside a head unit on my bike to be able to track all the numbers that these things were putting out. But I then remembered a method of tracking training zones that I'd actually learned in GCSE PE of all places. A method that's not only great for beginners because of its simplicity and affordability, but also great for more intermediates and advanced, something that I actually still use to this day alongside my heart rate and power data. Today I want to take you through this method so that if you're a beginner, you can start doing some structured training without having to spend loads of money. And if you're more intermediate and advanced like myself, so you can just do some riding without having to stare at blooming numbers the whole time. I'm Jonny, a coach and personal trainer who in the last few years has found a passion for training on two wheels. Join me as I document my journey to become a stronger cyclist, whilst hopefully sharing some of my coaching knowledge to help you too. See you on the road. So the method I studied back then and still use to this day, you may have heard of, is spoken about every now and again, but never in its entirety so you can actually use it. At the end of the video, I'll tell you how you actually relate it to your training zones to actually go about doing some structured training using this method. But this method is called the torque test. And stay with me here because you probably haven't heard about the torque test in its entirety and how it relates to things like heart rate and power, and how also as an intermediate or more advanced cyclist, you should be using it alongside those metrics, and as a beginner, how you can use it really, really effectively. So where you may have heard it before is you need to be doing a lot of your training in zone 2, an endurance zone, at a conversational pace. And it's that conversational pace piece that comprises the start of the torque test. So the torque test is essentially how many words you could get out in a single go. Could you speak sentences? Could you speak a few words at a time? Could you maybe just speak one word at a time, dependent on your breathing rate? But that conversational pace actually only relates to the start of the torque test training zones. That's only zone 1. But how do you then go about tracking things like zone 2 and zone 3 when you're putting more effort in and tracking the amount of time you're spending in different training zones? There's lots of science behind this method, and it's actually really, really accurate. But before we go into scientifically how the torque test actually works, let's go through the kind of pros and cons of using the torque test compared to using things that you might be used to using already, such as heart rate and power. So heart rate and power are obviously most commonly used because they're just so quantifiable, which is great. And I'm not saying we need to get rid of heart rate and power. They're definitely important metrics to track. But heart rate and power can be pretty expensive, especially power meters these days. So that's the first benefit and pro of the torque test, is that it's cheap. You don't necessarily need to buy anything at all. You don't need a heart rate strap. You don't need a power meter. You don't really even need a cycling computer. All you need to be able to do is concentrate on your breathing and potentially talk to somebody next to you, or imagine if I was to talk, how many words could I get out in a row? But more on exactly how to track that and utilize the torque test a little bit later on. All you might potentially need is some kind of timer. If you are looking at being in certain zones for certain periods of time, you might just need a watch or a Garmin or a Wahoo cycling computer to track how long your breathing rate has been at a certain level. The second pro is also that it's super simple. So it doesn't matter how much you know about cycling, how much you know about training, or how knowledgeable you are, you'll definitely know how many words you can get out in a sentence at a time without being interrupted by having to breathe so much. That's why this method is so great for those starting out on the bike wanting to do a little bit of structured training. The torque test can also be applied to so many other zone models too. So as cyclists, you may or may not be aware that there's kind of 7 cycling training zones, if you like. We'll go through this a little bit later on. But the torque test does directly correlate to these zones. There's just less zones for the torque test, meaning it's a little bit more simple. And the final pro is just being able to get out and really enjoy your riding without having to concentrate on your Garmin or Wahoo or whatever it is you use so much. It's great being able to see the numbers and where you're at, but sometimes, especially myself, when it comes to my mental well-being, sometimes it's just nice to get out on the bike, kind of know where I'm at in terms of zones and effort due to my breathing rate and how much I could talk, but then just really enjoying the scenery, enjoying being out there, and not necessarily looking at my Garmin and having my power meter and heart rate belt either turned off or left at home. But obviously the benefits of heart rate and power are that they're very quantifiable, and there's lots of science backing them up, and there's lots of science saying, you know, you should be in this zone or at this heart rate or power for a specified period of time. But there's actually lots of science behind the torque test, and it is pretty accurate. So before we get into exactly how you use it for your training and what the zones are, let's go through how it actually works. So we all probably know when we're cycling or riding, we're taking in oxygen, utilizing the oxygen to produce energy, and then producing a waste product, which is CO2, and then wanting to breathe that out. as we cycle harder, we're essentially wanting to take in more oxygen up to a certain point and expend and expel more carbon dioxide. Therefore, the harder we work, the more we breathe in and the more we breathe out. And if you've ever been into a sports science lab or seen anyone taking a fitness test or a VO2 max test, you'll see that the person is wearing a mask, which is essentially measuring how much oxygen that person is taking in, looking at their VO2 max level, what's the maximum amount of oxygen they can take in and utilize per minute. They're also measuring how much carbon dioxide they're breathing out, therefore their gaseous exchange, and from that they can work out lots of different things. So essentially there's lots of science behind our breathing rate and how that correlates to how hard we're working. And you'll see if you've been into your Garmin app recently that they're now starting to predict your breathing rate during your sessions, which helps kind of quantify your fitness level as well as a few other things too. But how do you actually use it for your training on the bike, and how do you know what zones you're in? So to measure your breathing, all you're essentially going to be doing, as I said previously, is just taking note of how many words you could say if you were to try and have a conversation or sing a song if you like. Whatever you want to do. But quickly, before we go into the actual training zones and what breathing rate and talking rate correlates to what zone, let's just quickly go through cycling training zones if you don't know what they are. So there's generally 2 zone models, if you like. There's a 5-zone model and a 7-zone model. 5-zone model is usually used for running or where you're using your heart rate. So there's 5 different zones, the top one being a kind of VO2 max zone, 90 to 100% of your maximum heart rate, and at the bottom you've got zone 1 there, which is a very easy sort of recovery zone where you're not putting in too much effort. Zone 2 is where you'll be spending the majority of your time. This is where you're sort of going at 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate. This is building your endurance. With the 7-zone model, it's essentially exactly the same. However, with cycling, there's 2 zones above zone 5 because we can do things like sprints and work a little bit harder and do things that are kind of above your maximum heart rate, if you like, that you can only kind of track with power. Because you can't hold them for prolonged periods, your heart rate's never actually going to get up super, super high while doing these. But the talk test has 3 zones, and this is why it's a little bit more simple. But how do these 3 zones correlate to the normal 7? So zone 1 for the talk test is essentially zones 1 and 2 on the 7-zone model. It's either your recovery zone or your kind of endurance zone. This is building your base fitness, your endurance. It's where you'll spend a lot of time on the bike. And to measure and to find out if you're in zone 1, when you're speaking or imagining if you're speaking, if you don't actually want to speak while you're out on the bike or sing or do whatever you want to do, you'll be able to get out full sentences without having to catch your breath between words. So this is zone 1 of the talk test. Can have a nice little conversation, can speak in full sentences, and it can even say long words like that without running out of breath at all. Zone 2 of the talk test, so the middle of the talk test, because there's only 3 zones, is your threshold zone. So this is on the common 7-zone model, this is zones 3 and zones 4. This is rides at or around your FTP, so efforts you could probably sustain for around about 20 minutes to an hour. This is where you're putting in a decent bit of effort, but things aren't getting really, really hard as of yet. There's probably a little bit of lactate building up in your legs are burning, but you're just about able to carry on and push through for a decent amount of time. In zones 2 for the talk test, you'd be able to say a couple of words before taking a breath. Here's an example. Okay, zone 2 of the talk test. I can just about say a couple of phrases before having to catch my breath. This is pretty tough to speak, but I can still do it and hold a conversation. And finally for the talk test, we've got zone 3. So this is zones 5 or higher. So anything 5, 6 or 7, this is your zone 3 for the talk test. This is your VO2 max zone, or where you kind of be putting in efforts anywhere up to say 4, 5, 6 minutes at a push. This is where you'd probably be doing intervals because you can't really hold them for prolonged periods of time. And it's kind of where you'd be pushing for, I don't know, a hill, for example, maybe in zone 3 for the talk test, but then needing to recover back in zones 2 or 1 once you're at the top of the hill. And for zone 3, you'd be only able to get 1 word out at a time because it's very tricky. And this is why when you're on those group rides or riding with a friend, everybody goes pretty quiet when cycling up a hill. So here's an example of what zone 3 might sound like. And this is now zone 3. Going up a big hill. Something to keep in mind as well while using the talk test is that your breathing rate and actually also your heart rate, because both are closely linked, they take a little while to catch up with the effort you're putting out on the bike. So when you're doing intervals out on the bike or sprinting, for example, power would rise instantly, because that's measuring what you're actually putting through the pedals, whereas your heart rate and breathing rate take a little while to kind of catch up and essentially realize what you're doing on the bike. So when you are using the torque test to measure your efforts, just be aware that it will take a minute or two for your breathing rate to rise to the kind of correct level for the effort that you're actually putting in. That's why obviously using things like power and also heart rate are still really beneficial, especially if you're looking to do some more intense training, but the torque test is also really great if you're wanting a simpler or cheaper way to measure your efforts on the bike. If you enjoyed this video, do check this one here where I finally bought a power meter after 8 years of using heart rate and the torque test. And I also go through if getting a power meter, if you haven't got one already, is worth doing. But thanks so much for watching, ride strong, and I'll catch you in the next one.